in the Fireside PM podcast, and I'm joined by an old friend of mine, Matthew Berk, who is the co-founder and CEO of BeanBox. Many of you might have heard my interview with Ryan Fritzke, who is another co-founder of BeanBox and also a good old friend. Welcome to the show, Matthew. How are you, sir?
I'm well. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to. You and I always have good conversations, so
We do.
I have a feeling we'll be able to let this one kind of go wherever it goes, and it'll be fun. I wish I had a cup of coffee right now, to be honest with you.
I know where
Um,
you can get a great cup of coffee.
that's right. Well, why don't we start with a little intro to who you are, what you do today, and then I would love to talk about your journey because you weren't like the stereotypical Silicon Valley entrepreneur, who went a very clear path. Like you've done a lot of interesting things, and I'd love to kind of touch on that. But yeah, let's start with the introduction.
Sure. So I'm Matthew Berk. I'm the CEO of BeanBox. Um, Writ large, we're a coffee company. We sell coffee online. What we do specifically is we curate coffee from 50 different independent coffee roasters all over the United States. And we also curate coffee from farms all over the world. We bring it to our facility in Seattle, and we manufacture it into products that are usually multi-coffee tasting products. And we do that in the form of subscriptions and kind of one-off coffee sales and coffee gifts, especially seasonally. And we do all of that in the service of helping people discover better coffee. We are tracking a trend, which is the shift in appetite for really high-end coffee away from little cafes that are geographically kind of spread out to people's homes. And so we're kind of tracking and addressing that market. And when we started, that market didn't exist. And we spoke to people and they're like, what do you mean sell coffee online? No, 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 you sell coffee in a cafe. And so our mission is really to get to a place where when people think about having great coffee at home, they think about Beanbox and they trust us to curate and they trust our tasting experiences. And that's what we're going after. We see ourselves as an applied technology company in a really old school kind of fuddy-duddy space, which is moving beans from all over the world to consumers in their home.
And how did you end up doing this business? Because when we were working together, you were a classic head of engineering for a technology company. There were no physical products that ever touched
No.
our teams. And this is a different type of business. How did you end up there?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I love the answer that I have, which is wandering and figuring it out over time. So this is the first, and we've been doing this 9 years. We're going into our 10th
Mm,
holiday season. But for me, this is the first gig where any physical product, maybe that's not drop shipped, any physical product is involved, where there is a very heavy component to what we do, which is uh, concrete and physical and involves moving literally tons of materials and manufacturing it into physical products and then shipping those physical products. And um, it's the first time I've ever done that. And it follows a trend that I've been interested in for a really long time. I've been working in the web since 1996, but I've always been fascinated about kind of the intersection of information online specifically and the real world. And I've had other gigs where that was explicitly what I thought about in a startup environment. But Beanbox is unique for me because it is that how do you use information to manage sort of the flow of physical goods, sourcing, supply chain, receipt, inventory, manufacture,
mm.
workflow, automation, inventory again, and then fulfillment, shipping, tracking, all in the service again of a consumer need. But it's for me again, it's kind of the first time I'm literally hands deep and dirty in the world of coffee, and we stumbled into it out of the kind of carcass of another startup, which was also about the intersection of kind of things in the real world and information. And that startup was about helping people to share personal recommendations. And so Ryan, who you interviewed a couple of weeks ago, he and I were working on that. We had a couple of patents in the space. We built a couple of apps. We had kind of a data mining platform where you could say that I trust Tom for restaurants in Palo Alto, but maybe I don't trust Tom for skiing equipment. And those recommendations would be weighted according to kind of your community and your network, and they would be exposed to you. And it was a great startup experience in that um, there are many other folks who are kind of pushing in this direction now, but I think it was early. Um, I think that use case is covered by other things. You see it sometimes, but we thought it was like a really interesting idea, but it just, like many interesting ideas in a startup from an execution standpoint, it did not take and it did not grow. And so out of the carcass of that, Ryan and I spent many days literally walking tens of miles around Seattle and thinking like, oh, well, what do we want to do next? And we had some investment capital left over.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to our investors and said, we could just return this. And we have some assets. Those are the patents, and call it a day, or we can roll the dice. And they said, you know what, this is about you. We invested in you. We knew the idea was a lark. So if you have some cash and you want to try something, that's great. And so we kind of thought long and hard about like, what are the criteria for the space we want to go into with the remaining capital? And, there were a few things that stuck out. Like number one, we wanted to be in a cash generating business, like no more speculative software development, no more speculative patent development. Although, ironically, about a half decade after those patents, we ended up selling them. So they were worth something. But we wanted to be in a cash generating business. We also, we both liked e-commerce. I had done that a bunch of times in my past. And there was a weird new requirement that had never been kind of part of my career explicitly, which is do something that is joyful, that people love. And we're like, well, no, that's usually not part of the criteria. And I had worked on all, like websites and ad servers and search engines and, like there's a lot of stuff online. I'm not sure the world needs more stuff online. And so we thought like, let's use our kind of experience doing things online to help people offline. And that took the form of like, hey, there's this weird appetite for coffee. And Tom, this, like, when we were working on those apps, you interview your users.
At
And
coffee
so
shops.
at coffee shops, you buy them a coffee and you sit them
Yeah.
down and you say, well, how do you do this and that? And we had done that so many times in this startup that, didn't go. And it was just kind of right under our noses. And ironically, we were in this little neighborhood in Seattle where like there are these kind of third wave, super hip cafes. And we shifted from, like taking people to coffee downtown at a Starbucks to these little cafes. And we're like, hey, this coffee is different. Like there's something going on here. And as we discovered coffee, we thought like, hey, there's an opportunity. And that opportunity is we're not coffee snobs. We're not coffee aficionados, but we enjoy it. And so how do you help someone enjoy better coffee without having a psychological barrier, making it accessible, getting across those geographical boundaries where maybe you don't have a cafe locally. And so, all this to say that we said, hey, there's something in coffee. And the more we dug into it, the more we found that there was this huge appetite for better coffee. And we thought, let's use the internet to move this, and let's use our background in technology to build a company that can do it and maintain freshness and build novel product and all the other good stuff. And so we kind of fell ass backwards into a startup. And the criteria that's really stuck around, like obviously we're still an applied tech company. We've grown a bunch. We've been doing it for almost 10 years, but the item that's still there every day that's amazing is it's joyful. And our customers really love our coffee. They're excited to get it. They read the descriptions. They They come back and buy things when we talk about them in certain ways. And our customers love our product. It is food. They grind it up and brew it and put it in their bodies. And there's a real kind of visceral trust there. And it has an element of joy that, although I've loved everything else I've built in the past, it hasn't taken that form. And so I think one of the things that like keeps us going in
Mm.
a startup, which is always hard, is like this thing we found our way into is wrapped in joy, our customer joy, our personal joy. We taste coffee every day and it's delightful. And I never thought that would be an explicit part of my career, but it has become that.
Yeah, do you think that if it weren't connected to this joyful passion and area of kind of interest that you both share, do you think that you might not have made it to the 9 years? Like, I'm curious, was that a reservoir that you would have had to dip into from time to time, or was it one of those things where, hey, once we did the pivot, it was just rocket ship all the way? Like, what was that journey like?
No, I mean, it's always fits and starts. Even as
Mm.
recent as last year, like major fits and starts. We took a huge gamble on going into wholesale. And in our first year, we did, almost 20% of our revenue in wholesale. We'd never done that before. We wanted to go direct to consumer. Last year, we did like $2.1 million in wholesale
Hmm.
out of nowhere in our first year. And that was a huge gamble. And after doing that for a year, even less than a year, with all of the stuff involved, like, having a dock and doing pallets for everything and shipping hundreds of pallets and doing EDI integrations, which, gosh, I haven't done since the 90s. After all of that, we're like, hey, that is not working for us. The margin profile is different. It
Mm.
has a lot of risk. You don't connect directly with your customer, which is important to us. And so we have fits and starts all the time. And I would say, kind of to your question, like the things that keep us going are number one, like partnership. And I don't know that that's talked about enough in the startup world, especially for companies with co-founders. It's usually talked about like at the executive level. But we are founder, co-founder, and like we fall back on each other when things get difficult or confusing. Um, and I think that's been kind of a well and a resource. I think the other part is like kind of the joy factor in what we do, whether that's setting up a conveyor system or hearing from a customer that they love a coffee because it tastes like grapes. And they're like, how is this possible? But I think the other thing, and it hasn't been rocket ship, but it's certainly been like we've approached it from many, many different places. We have created and sunset products really fast over 10 years, like super fast. A subscription that didn't go anywhere, a box that didn't go anywhere, a type of a gift, and we have iterated over time. But the thing that's great is we always find that product market fit. So even if it's not perfect, there's kind of something in our DNA. People love our coffee. People want to drink our coffee. People see our app and our website and texting with us. They see that as a pass through to a really great product. And it's an interesting thing to be in a world where your product market fit is not limited to the website or the app that you have or the software that you write that consumers interact with. There is a pass through to another set of products, and those are the physical products that again they grind up every
Mm-hmm.
morning and brew and put into their bodies. And so that product market fit and having like a core of there is something here. It's kind of about the discovery and the curation and the accessibility and the relevance and the way we describe coffee. And that has always been consistent. And where we've varied is like we circle that sort of that core DNA and we approach it, we go farther and then we come back. And those are the experiments we've been doing for 10, almost 10 years over and over again. So it's not like rocket ship. I think, short of a couple of examples, I think rocket ship is a myth. And if you plan around the notion of getting to rocket ship, I don't think that's a good way to plan. Like the way to plan is like we're gonna we're gonna see if we can get that core DNA right. And if the core is right, then we're gonna get all kinds of other stuff wrong. But we can fall back on the things that people love about what we're doing. And that means it's easy to fail. because you can always come back to, oh, this is a better version of it, or we're curating ever better coffee, or our descriptions are better, or so it's been. I think those are the reservoirs we fall back on when things get difficult. It's like the partnership among co-founders. It's the joy of building things. It's the fact that we have a product market fit, and it's this kind of personal joy that's wrapped into or around everything that we do.
How did you first discover or conclude that you had that fit, that core recipe, like, okay, this is the thing? Because clearly, if you run an experiment, it's not working, and it's definitely not working. Like, we all know what that looks like. But there are times where you're not quite there yet. You're close, but you could misinterpret it as like, well, this is the thing because we had the best quarter ever, blah blah blah. How did you guys end up saying, okay, yeah, these are the core ingredients. There's other stuff going on, but this is the core.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in our previous startup, I have a picture of this, and it's so instructive. Um, so when we were working on this kind of person-to-person recommendation sharing system and apps, we were doing a big push on our product, and the main
Mm-hmm.
product was the app. And we had put all of the things we thought were critical to product market fit on Post-it notes.
Mm-hmm.
It's classic like Agile. You put it up on the board, you move it as it progresses. And so we have a picture of me standing in front of this board where there's like 120 Post-it notes, and they're all in the complete, kind of section.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I remember taking that picture and feeling so proud and
Mm-hmm.
releasing it, and none of them moved the needle. And the needle
Mm-hmm.
was, do people want to come back and use it? And so, like I had spent weeks and weeks like hammering out feature after feature after feature after feature, and none of them moved the needle. None of them changed the fact that people would use it
Mm-hmm.
and then not come back to use it again. And so in that case, the core DNA is, what is it about what you're doing that makes people want to do it? And I think it was such a great lesson for me, because often we equate the output of work
Yep.
with moving in the direction of product market fit. If it only had like, a viral sharing feature, if it only
Mm-hmm.
had a, you know, tap once to take a picture, or if it only had voice input for recommendations, if we only had an Android. And like fundamentally, if you know what the measure is, and for us the measure was like, are they using it again?
Mm-hmm.
You apply a different sort of litmus, and you realize that like you can put all the features in the world on it. You can take every great feature from every great product you've ever seen on a phone, and you can hammer them into your product. And if people don't want to use it, you're going to know right away. And we knew right away. And I think when it comes to what we're doing with Beanbox, the core, is really like, do people buy the product? That's in e-commerce. That's kind of like that's table stakes. But there's another one, which is, do they buy more product? And so we look at LTV, LTR, and LTV a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at that more than we look at things like churn for our subscription line of product, because it tells you whether or not they'll come back, just like the app. It's not enough for people to love what you do. They have to love it again and again and again, and use it again and again and again, and buy it again and again and again. And we don't care about like, do they share it, word of mouth? It's hard to track. What we care about is like, what's the LTR, and then what's the LTV? And so the core of what we do, which is get great coffee, make it relevant, help people discover it, and get it to them in a way that's fresh, and sometimes in a super novel product format. And people respond to that by buying it and then buying more of it. And it's the buying more of it that's kind of the DNA, or the litmus of the DNA. And so again, we've circled that DNA, getting things wrong and getting things right, and varying what we do and how we do it. But it's an amazing world to like look at 50 different things that we could develop, and knowing that probably 49 and a half of them aren't going to make a difference around our LTR. And so we think about like,
Yeah.
how do we make it better for customers to want to do more of what they do with us? And it's it's actually led to a really interesting thing for us, which is, we talk to investors and they're like, oh, I see you have a subscription. And so it instantly blots out the other product formats that we have. They're like, oh, I know how to evaluate this. You're a subscription company. And we say, well, we've got gifts and people buy a la carte. And they're like, no, 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 you're a subscription company. And so, like, I want to see CAC to LTV, but I also want to know your churn, right? I want to make sure you're not a leaky bucket, all the standard thinking. And we used to think this way. And we struggled mightily over how to calculate churn and how to do the kind of stackable returns on your cohorts and all the technical analysis of subscription products and their economics. And what we realized is like people would churn, and we thought, oh, we got 2% churn last month. Oh my God, like we're dead. We're a leaky bucket. But then the same people would come back and buy things that weren't a subscription. And so we saw increasing LTR
Mm.
even after people had churned. And so officially, like that's a problem for your subscription, but unofficially, outside of that framework, that core DNA is just making people come back. They've just decided that they don't need it in the form of a subscription. Maybe they're buying a gift, maybe they're buying something else. And so like that is a core litmus for whether or not we've got that product market fit. And as long as we see increasing LTR, it means that we're doing something right. Even if we get a product that's DOA, if our products at large are doing well and people buy it and rebuy it, and then we know we're kind of doing the right thing. And as I said, it's like there are two levels of product. One is the kind of, we have an app and we have a website and we have all of our manufacturing software and this and that, and that's kind of level one. But level two is like people are going to open a bag. That bag's going to contain beans. Those beans are going to come from all over the world. And when they brew it into a cup, they're either going to like it or not like it, or on some level appreciate what we've said about it or how we've presented it. And that's like the core of the product market fit, not whether or not, we have a chatbot that allows you to offer, buy coffee, or whether we have a quiz that uses AI to tell you your perfect cup of coffee, or like those don't move the needle. What moves the needle is having product people want to buy again and again and again and again. It's really
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah, it's such a uh profound kind of first principles approach to problem solving. And it's refreshing, especially coming from Silicon Valley. It's sometimes we do get caught up in the latest technology.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you?
I'd love to hear more about how you thought and continue to work with investors. Because on the one hand, those investors see a lot of deals and they do have visibility into lots of wins and losses that, in theory, like are very valuable and can help you. On the other hand, like they don't know your business like you do, and also like their incentives are a little bit different. Like they're looking for fast fails and unicorns, and anything in between doesn't really move the needle for them. How do you think about working, or how have you thought about working with investors leading up to now, in terms of like what's the best way to partner with them and still maintain kind of your own identity and trust your own judgment?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've never taken venture. We have a really close circle of investors. They've been incredibly supportive. Some of them have been, they were in that previous startup. So we've had some supporting us for 11 years,
Mm,
which is it's kind of crazy.
mm-hmm,
And we've had some that have participated in every round, at least one round, every kind of, let's call it 18 months for 9 years. And so they're really supportive of what we're doing, and they know we're going to make mistakes. I think what we try and do with the closest investors is where we don't know what we're doing, we ask for their help. And those things aren't like, oh, how do you hire the best fill in the blank, or can you make an intro to someone else? It's like, let's sit down and we're going to tell you, like, here's something we're struggling with. Have you seen this before? Do you know anyone who's dealt with it?
mm-hmm,
And so I think what we like to do with our closest investors is kind of use them as a resource where we don't know what the heck we're doing and we need more perspective. And even if they don't have that perspective, they generally know someone. The investors that sit on our board are, they always think like 2 steps ahead of how we think, and they're not in it. And so that distance is really valuable to us, because we're so wrapped up in it. We had one board meeting where we have a board observer, and he's so he's absurdly he's absurdly bright. Like, I'm no dummy, but I can't I have a hard time keeping up with him. I always realize I'm like multiple steps behind him. But I think we were talking about, like, investing forward in marketing during the holiday period so that we could, have expanded lifetime revenue or more LTR in the coming year, and how our Q1 and Q2 is influenced by the number of subscriptions we sell in Q4 when we have a peak, and and we're like so close to it. And he's like, guys, like nickels into dimes. Like, that's all you need to think about is like, how do you spend a nickel and get a dime? I realize there's complexity here, and you can get lost in that complexity. He's like, you just tell me when we can take a nickel and turn it into a dime. And that's kind of the old approach, which is like, wait until you're capital constrained. When the only constraint is capital, then you're probably in a good place, provided that that capital can issue a return. And that involves a lot of stuff. It's CAC to LTV, it's payback period, it's what your margin is, like what's the gross margin of your business, which we have worked so hard on. And so sometimes, like, we rely on our investors to call BS on us and just say, like, there was like a 2-year period where we're like nickels into dimes, into dimes, and every time we thought about margin, every time we thought about payback, every time we thought about cost of acquisition, it was like that cut through it. I think the other thing about that we've learned about investors is, we're it's okay to show that you struggle. Like, any investor that shows up and expects perfection, um, we're not signing up for that. Like, this is a journey, and so we appreciate investors who are like, yeah, this is a long journey. As I said, we've had investors who've been with us for since 2012, and the rocket ship myth is, I think this goes to your point, which is like venture looks for certain attributes, and we may not have the venture attributes. What we do have is an amazing product market fit. We have customers who go crazy for our product. We are operating in a huge sandbox, like the total addressable market. And we're growing year after year, and we're developing innovative products, and we're building the moat. And so, like, we have these attributes, but minus the kind of push in 20 million in this round, and your next round's going to be 40 million. And like, because we're operating in a space that's brand new, that we helped to create and still tiny, we're growing with the growth of the market. And so in many respects, if we threw capital at the problem in our first year, well, we wouldn't be around. Even in our third year, our fifth year, if we threw $20 million at it, we would not be around. And there are all kinds of cases of people taking too much capital before they have a product market fit, before maybe the market exists. And you see this everywhere. You see
Hmm.
companies where, like, if you tally up the total amount of revenue over 5 years, it's 1/10 of the amount that they've raised, or worse in some cases.
Hmm.
Companies pulling in 50 million on $5 million of revenue, and things are less frothy now. But those are not the those are not the attributes we want to demonstrate. We want to build this market as we grow and cultivate that demand in a way that's very, very hard to replicate. And if we can do that, then independent of valuation, we're going to build value, and lots of it, and it's going to be really hard for people to figure out and duplicate. And that's kind of what we're after. And we try and say that to our investors.
It's such an interesting journey that you all have been on for the last 9, 10 years now. It's also not the traditional path that a lot of folks when they think about entrepreneurship, especially on the West Coast in this day and age, it's about raising that Series A and B and getting acquired or being on a path to pre-IPO. And I'm wondering, when you look back, what do you think are some of the trade-offs that you've made, and how do you feel about that? Because I could see a ton of pros, and then there's some opportunity cost too. Like, how do you assess the last decade, as a founder of Beanbox?
Yeah, I mean, look, like I really feel if we had raised too much too early, um, I'm not sure we'd be around because we
Mm,
wouldn't like, um, like resource constraints go a long way. So there's a pro and a con. It's like if you don't have a lot of money, like you can't run a lot of tests, you can't do a lot of advertising, you can't. Um, but when you operate with constraint, you make different decisions. Like your experiments are smaller, but the payoff can be larger. The leverage is much bigger. If you spend $1 million in a month on budget, and we have, I mean, we have a holiday peak, which is absurd, and it's large, and it's large enough for us to test things at scale. But the leverage on, like, for example, spending $1 million on customer acquisition is hard unless you really have proved that out at other levels. So I think much of the time, like capital removes those constraints, and often you're not ready to spend the capital. But after honing what we do for 9 years, like we feel very much capital constrained. We're like, we know what this looks like when you spend $1 million. Like we know what the returns on. Like we know what the product margin is. So yeah, it's definitely a trade-off. But the other one from an entrepreneur standpoint is like the level of control you get to express.
mm,
Where if you do a venture round, and you know this, like the work you do post that round in the 18 months it typically lasts is all about demonstrating you're ready for your next round,
mm-hmm,
right? And so, like we don't have that luxury because we have to bring cash in, as we're a cash business, and so we focus on that LTR, we focus on revenue, we focus on the gross margin of the business, and it is a trade-off. Like those are hard, the constraints are difficult, but they also breed creativity and more experiments, I think, and more control over what you do and how you do it. So we have the control to say, like there was one year where we did nothing but, and we did, it was our first kind of mildly profitable year, and all we talked about was margin, right? And like every time we put something for sale on the website, we're like, okay, what are the cogs and what's the margin and how do we, I mean, it was like crazy. Even if we were showing like 50 coffees in a section, they would be ranked by kind of a combination of sales rank plus margin, where margin was more heavily weighted. And so I think, like in some scenarios, when you bring in a lot of capital, you're not going to worry about margin. And so like the tuning of the
mm-hmm,
engine of like your core economic attributes is not it's not a requirement until you get to a place like many startups have, where there's no more capital and they're like, yeah, now you got to be profitable. And they're like, well, we've never even talked about margin. Like, um,
yeah,
so
it's a different. Go ahead.
it's a different beast. The
Yeah.
constraints allow you to think about the fundamental attributes of the business, and how those survive long term. And I think you just have a different focus. But again, like it's a difference between like having a big war chest
Mm-hmm.
and having a couple of dollars to spend.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's no doubt in my mind that when you have to build a self-sustaining business where your income, where your revenue covers your expenses, um, you're just gonna treat every penny like it's precious, and that's not the approach that. And in fact, if you did that in some bull markets as a venture-backed startup, probably some investors would be like, "Hey, you're going too slow. Like,
Hmm.
this is a race, this is a land grab. Like, go for it, kind of thing." So I totally hear that, and I I wonder, just as a thought exercise, if you took the counterpoint, if you did have 10, 15 million bucks just to play around with, do you think has there ever been a period where having that much dry powder would have been good for you? Or do you think it would have been like a pile of cocaine and you'd get yourself into trouble?
Well, look, we find ways of getting into trouble anyway, dollars or no dollars. I think we're there.
Hmm.
Like it's taken almost a decade, but we're there. Like we know how to negotiate pricing on coffees. We know how to source green coffee. Like those are all huge for our margin. We have a really kind of, I think, a pretty clever solution to hacking shipping, like
Hmm.
giving customers more options, faster transit, and spending less on it, which is really hard. That's like I wrote code this morning to compare shipping algorithms. Like you can't stop doing that. But like last year, we manufactured 250,000 products to sell at retail that we didn't control, and like that's a big scale. It was one project, two products, 250,000 units,
Hmm.
95,000 pounds of coffee, and like we're at the scale where we're like, yeah, we can do that, and we did do that in a couple of months. And so I think we're at a point where like that capital is dry powder that going back to our investor, nickels into
Mm-hmm.
dimes, like just do that. And so I think after again almost 10 years, like it feels like we're ready for that. Like we know our two-year LTR, and obviously we have a gross margin. We translate that to LTV. We know our I mean we know our economics kind of cold, and so I think like we're pretty we're pretty close to that. And again, like the market has taken time to develop.
Mm-hmm.
People were not used to buying coffee online when we started. They just weren't. You could have thrown as much money as you wanted at that, and it would have taken time to percolate. It just would have. But I do think we've done so much work to be in a position where like that 2-year LTR, we're not guessing, we're not estimating, like we're
Mm.
not doing a projection there. Like we've had customers for 9 years and like
Yeah.
they're still getting a subscription. And like we know their 2-year LTR. Like we just know it. It's real data. It's not a projection. And we've gone through peak periods in holiday where we've brought in like 50,000 new customers within a 6-week period. So we've seen scale. But it's taken a really long time to even know like, well, what are the fundamentals? And um, so you go slower and you have less resource and you're forced to solve really hard problems. Like margin's a really hard problem, shipping's a
Mm-hmm.
really hard problem. And then all the physical stuff, like manufacturing a product is really difficult. And when it's composed of these little beans that are, they're like this big, you got to keep track of a lot of moving pieces. So
Oh
we
yeah.
love that. Like there's just a joy to all of those problems. It's kind of like the stuff I did before in software. Like those were like maybe there's a musical analogy. Like those were songs, or maybe they're like occasionally there was a symphony, but it was
Mm-hmm.
all digital. Like when you do e-commerce and when you manufacture, it's like an opera.
Mm.
And it's got everything. It's got every form of art. It's got, there are algorithmic problems and financial problems and physical problems and automation problems. And that's like being able to dip into all those problems and know which ones are hard and then attacking them. And I think you only do that when you have constraint. And that, again, to me, that's part of like the joy is like there are so many problems to focus on. And that's just fantastic.
Yeah. It's definitely the opposite of the classic Silicon Valley startup where everybody's trying to figure out, well, how do I make a moat? Because anybody with three smart engineers and access to GCP like is going to build this thing overnight. Like nobody's going to copy Beanbox with three smart engineers and build it overnight. That is just Good luck to them if
Yeah,
they try. Yeah.
yeah, because it's the all of the and we haven't talked about this, but like there's all of the physical stuff
Oh
that's
God.
taken
Yeah.
a decade to figure out. Like, like I had no way of knowing this though. Like ground coffee is different than whole bean coffee. And if you're going to do stuff at scale, like last year we shipped 3 million bags of coffee.
Mm,
And so some of it is ground and some of it is whole bean. And what you don't know, like, because you have to automate to get to that scale. And our bags are not big bags. They're 2
mm-hmm.
ounces of coffee, or 1.85 ounces. So
Mm-hmm.
I never knew that like whole bean coffee is free flowing, but ground coffee is not free flowing. And so if you try and move ground coffee the way you move whole bean coffee, like you're dead. And so we've
Mm,
had to like develop like, oh, okay, well, you move it as whole bean and then you grind immediately prior to use, which is
mm,
dosing and filling. But then there are other things, is like some forms of moving coffee work for large batches only and not small batches. Some forms of moving, like if you try and move ground using air, which moves it very effectively, you fluidize it, and then different particle densities go into different areas. And so you separate out the coffee,
mm,
and because you're also fluidizing and using air, you remove the aromatics of the coffee. And so there are like all of these things that like we just never knew. And so like when you talk about moat, like you're right, like software is the moats are kind of the intelligence behind the software and maybe
mm-hmm.
traction.
Mm-hmm.
But when you talk about things that are physical, like those moats are very real and they're hard to figure out. They take a long time, and they're hard to replicate.
Yeah, for sure. Um, One last thing I want to hit with you before we wrap up. You've been partnered with the same co-founder for almost a decade now. That's not easy. That's longer than some marriages. um, how do you attribute, like, what do you attribute having a successful partnership for that long? And what advice would you give to people who are maybe thinking of starting a business and trying to figure out who they should partner up with?
Yeah, it's been longer than 10 years. You know, it's been 11 years of working together on startups,
Mm,
and we worked together. As you know, we worked together before that. So we've known each other since 2006. Um, I think that, like one thing is like, how do you find a person that complements you?
mm-hmm.
And so I think, he does stuff that I could never do. If you put a gun to my head, I couldn't do it. And same, I do stuff that he doesn't want to do, or like he doesn't want to write code. Um, and so I think like one thing is like you have to look for the complement, and that can be hard to find because you're essentially assessing someone who knows stuff that you don't know how to assess, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing, is like, do they complement you? I think the other thing is, I remember like it was around like 2013, and he did the product and I did the code, and it was just the two of us in the very beginning, pre Beanbox. And like we had to have some really hard discussions. Like, sometimes we were sort of in a mode of like, let's figure out this product together, and other times we are in the mode where he's like, I'm specking this out, this is what you're going to do, and I didn't know which was which. And as you know, like that can lead to very hard discussions between engineers and product people. And so I think having a partner where you're willing to go through awkward stuff and figure it out, is very, very difficult. And when you find it, like that's super valuable. I think there also has to be like a quotidian enjoyment of working together. Like you
Mm-hmm.
speak the same language, you divide and conquer, you agree on values, like what's important and what isn't, and which you don't always know. Like that develops over time. So I think we've gone through a lot, and so the longer you're together, the longer, like you go through these challenges, and you're like, holy cow, I wish we knew before we did that. But then you also look at each other, and you're like, look, you know, we looked each other in the eye, we both pulled the trigger, we both decided to do this, and there's no blame, and there's a lot of learning, and let's stop and learn and move forward. And if you can do that with a co-founder, that's great. I think the other thing someone once told me that like if you have no mechanism for control, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And I used to believe that because someone really smart told it to me, but I don't think I believe it anymore. I think with the right co-founder, you can control together. You can make decisions together. And where there's a need to compromise, you can compromise together. And so I think a lot of founders get lost around at the very beginning. Co-founders get lost at the very beginning around like, what's the allocation of equity? And
Mm-hmm.
so that, make sure you have a mechanism for control is like 49-51. Who gets the 49? Who gets the 51? Or it's I think a lot of co-founders, when they're first finding each other and first starting something, they get lost in the equity and its promise, either because they think someone needs to have control or they can't resolve things, or because they get caught up in the opportunity, which is good. But for me, it's less about like what's the allocation of ownership and do you share equally in everything. And so it may be 50-50. That may change over time, but what's more important is like, do you feel co-equal in making decisions and in admitting errors and learning from that together? And so I think that those things have helped us to kind of keep hammering. And still, like, we wake up every day and we go to work and we're like, 10 feet away from each other, and we make decisions together and we divide and conquer, um, and we can keep going. Like it's delightful. So it's hard to find, but super valuable.
You alluded to times where it was really hard, um, where, the head of product and other key stakeholders, like they may not have agreed, or they weren't sure, hey, who's making the call here? Because, I think product leaders, I think we do want to have a very clear vision and have a strong say for sure on what we do and why.
Yeah.
I think it can't be well, product makes the call and everybody else executes on it. Like that's you're missing out on too much intelligence across the team. I'm curious, like, how did you all navigate that when you literally had an even number of people, you and Ryan, right? And where you didn't see complete eye to eye on a bet or a product spec or a problem to solve or whatever. Like, how did you guys navigate that?
So in my mind, like, I've looked at it a little bit differently, which is so especially in software, if you have let's say a product group or product team and a
Mm-hmm.
software team, I think what you want out of that working relationship is the software folks are not going to know everything that the product folks know, and vice versa. And especially in software, there may be things that are super valuable that only an engineer could creatively see
Mm-hmm.
that must be surfaced. Otherwise, and I know you've seen this too, otherwise it's like you can collaborate on what you're building, but it's like product comes up with the spec, they throw it over the fence, and then the engineers execute. But like the right environment is one where the engineers are like, are you sure you want this? Because we could do it better.
Mm.
Or like, this takes 4 steps. Like, well, why don't we just make it take 1 step? And sometimes it's hard to get your head around like what are the opportunities in software. And so you may use a thing to you may use a paper prototype, or you may use a bit of software. You're like, oh, well, you tap here and you tap here, and then this shows up. But an engineer might, a creative engineer, which is hard to find, would work with a product person and be like, oh yeah, I get that, but like, what if we did this and you just jumped over it, or
Mm-hmm.
what if you surfaced this data and you displayed it as, I don't know, you displayed it as a histogram and maybe that's an opportunity that product didn't see, and vice versa. Like, I don't is now it's not just Ryan, but we have a head curator who defines our products, and so we have more than just Ryan working on it, and she knows more than I would ever know about our voice, right? So there may be a physical product we're collaborating on, but I don't know what the voice should be. But similarly, like I may look at the physicality of the packaging and say, like, you know what, there's an opportunity here where we could manufacture it a lot quicker if instead of having a
Mm-hmm.
separate piece, there was a cutout and we folded the piece in. And it's that same collaboration that you have to lend to the other competence, the ability to be creative. And I think Ryan and I do that, and we do that with our curator when we're making physical product. And to me, that's what I go for. Then it feels less like who's in control of what, and more like I'm going to see things they're not going to see, and they're going to see things I'm not going to see. And like what we're looking for is leverage and opportunity between those perspectives. And I think that's a great way to run product. Unfortunately, sometimes the myth is like the allocation of creativity is on the product side, and the
Mm-hmm.
allocation of analytical skills or execution is on the software side. And I don't believe that at all. Um, so that's what we go for, and that's what I
Yeah,
think has worked for me. I don't know if that makes sense.
it totally does. I mean, I what I'm hearing is you all have found a way to kind of tap into everybody's individual secret sauce and help you allow each person to kind of bring the best version of themselves to a problem, and you don't get stuck in the, well, your product, so you make the decision, or your end, so you have to tell us exactly what the order it's done, or your marketing, so you tell us exactly what we're going to say. It definitely feels more like the lines are a little fuzzier, and it gives you some freedom to make that music together.
Yeah, and I coming back to something that I thought was like a great question is like constraint
Mm-hmm.
often enables that because you have no
Or requires
hierarchy.
it.
It requires it,
Yeah.
right? Because you're strapped on labor and you're
Yeah.
strapped on time,
Yeah.
and everyone has to bring everything they can to the table. And that's to me like resource constraint breeds that type of collaboration and creativity. And like people will tell you, oh, does that scale? But as you know, like there are organizations that scale up to 100 engineers, maybe working on one or two products, but the reality is there are like three people who make that product go. So, like I've always been a fan of like smaller,
Mm.
more control, less people, uh, tighter collaboration. You can yield a more interesting solution than deploying an army or even like
Mm-hmm.
a small team. Um, and again, like that's going to vary by organization and by stage of growth and all that stuff. But for me, what's always worked is like keep it tight, keep it small, keep control. Everybody does everything or brings every perspective they can, and out of that, you hope you get something that people are going to love. And what feels amazing is I think 9 years in, like we know that people love what we do, even if we get like a specific feature wrong or a specific product, or and we just redirect and we
Mm-hmm.
make a different feature, or we sunset it, or we evolve the product. And that to me is like just it's a joyful exercise that's more than just I'm a CTO or I'm
Mm-hmm.
an engineer, or yeah, it's like you get to do all the things all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that because you have a sound kind of business fundamentals. Your business fundamentals are sound. You can make mistakes, and it doesn't have to feel like, oh shit, there goes our Series C. We just screwed that up. It's not an existential bet the company, the God, this new feature better work kind of thing. It feels like you guys have you've earned some buffer, and you can kind of probe around the edges as you grow very steadily. So kudos to you, man.
It's all a delight, even when it's really hard going.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you want. I didn't know I could get that out of my career. I thought it would all be like, bits and electrons, all the way down until the end. And it turns out there are some atoms in there, and
There you go.
that's been really amazing. And I never thought that could be part of my career. And it is, and it's working, and that's cause to be happy.
Well, it's been an amazing conversation, Matthew. I'm not surprised that we had a lot to talk about. And I hope that we can get you back on the podcast again, maybe down the line for an update
Yeah.
on some new developments and learnings and mistakes and kind of joyful times and difficult times thank you for being so transparent and sharing your experience with us.
Yeah, thanks for a great, delightful chat. As always. As always.
All right, with that, we'll say till next time and see everybody later.